Welcome back to beer. It's a little bit chilly, but it's not too bad. So what Judd wanted me to visit with you about a little bit was, kind of talking about how you evaluate Brahman cattle. And I'm sort of preaching to the choir, but everybody sort of likes to look at other people's cattle, and so I just thought we'd talk about some of the things that are important to look at. And so when we're looking at animals and whether they're in a show ring or in a pen, whether they're bulls or they're heifers, the first thing I like to do is I just like to watch them walk, Cattle, they obviously have to look like a Brahman. Breed character is important. And go ahead and walk him around just a little bit. And, let him walk in a big circle. He's being led by a halter, but if he was out by himself in a pasture, you can do exactly the same thing. And I just want to watch him walk. Sort of natural and easy, and I want y'all to watch him walk too. So we'll look at where he picks up his front foot, okay, and then watch where he puts his hind foot. And so typically when we do that, in a natural gait, a natural walk, I want to see that hind foot pretty much fall into the tract of the front foot. So the left hind foot falls into the tract of the front foot, and so on. That sort of tells me a lot about his structural correctness, okay? Because if he wasn't structurally correct, he would walk a little bit different. His pattern would be different, okay? If he was a little bit straighter legged, okay, what we call post-legged, he's not. But if he were, that foot, that hind hoof would fall behind that front footprint. And you can see that pretty easy. Or if he was really crooked in his hind legs as he walked out, you would see him really put that foot a little bit in front of that front footprint. That hind foot would actually reach up there and more than cover, actually to the front of that front footprint. And so that's the first thing I sort of look at. I want to watch him walk. And to me, that's about 90% of his structural correctness. And I know that there's hoof trimmers out there that will tell you, oh, I can fix that. Sure they can. That what this bull actually does, or what that heifer might actually do in terms of her walking, that's heritable. We can change her a little bit. We can make him walk better. We can make him walk good. Yeah. Go ahead. Okay? But we can change the way that they walk. We can make them walk a little bit more cleanly and more smoothly. But structural correctness, the heritability of structural correctness is about the same as it is for yearling weight. Okay? So it's in mid-40s. And so, if we decide to propagate those poor genetics, okay, even though we can change them, if we decide to propagate it, then all of the sons and daughters out of those bulls or heifers or those cows that walk poorly, they're going to have that. So once I get around to sort of walking, now remember, he's an older bull, right? And he's also a heavier bull. And so lots of times when we're evaluating these cattle, we might be looking at them as wean calves, or maybe we're looking at them as yearlings. And so, we'll see a little bit different body shape and size. He's pretty much, what you see is what you get for him, okay? In terms of a mature animal, he's not going to change very much. Oh, he could lose a little bit more weight. He could gain a little bit more weight. He could get sick, okay? And as he gets older, he'll change a little bit. But as you look at him as a mature animal, he's about 95% there. And so when we're looking at an animal that's 7 months old or 12 months old, what we're trying to do is figure out what he's going to look like, or what she's going to look like when she's 24 or 36 or 48 months. Okay, and so what we try to do is look for these traits, and we want a little bit better animal than average, because we know that we're not getting a full measure of what they're going to be as a mature animal. We're sort of looking at it as an indicator. So I watched him walk. I like that. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start down at his feet, okay, at his hooves, okay. And so these guys, okay, unlike horses, okay, they have split feet, all right, split toes. And so if you look at your hand, what you can do is you can sort of separate your hand between your ring finger and your little finger, and then your index finger, your middle finger, and that's essentially the bones in his toes. Those are fused, okay? And those are the bones in his toes, okay? I can't do it with that hand very well, but I can do it with this hand, okay? And so if you look at that, so that's his left and his right toe. And what we want to see, we want them to be about the same size. Well, we don't want them to be about the same size. We want them to be the same size. We don't want one of those toes to be smaller than the other. Okay, we want them to be about the same size, and we want them to be about the same shape. And if you look at his, they're good. And yeah, once again, we can sort of fix that. You know, we trim feet, right? Sometimes they get too long. We make that, it allows the animal to walk a little bit better. But if you watch him walk, those toes are the same. Okay? Now what we want to do is we've looked at that. We want to make sure that there's a little bit of space between them, okay? Just like I have with my hands here. I want a little bit of space between them. I don't want them to lap over. Okay? And so I want them to be clean, and I don't want them to curl into each other. I don't want it to interfere with his ability to walk, because the reason why that hoof is split on all four of those feet is to spread his weight. Okay, to cushion him as he's walking. And so it doesn't make any difference if we start on the hind end or the front end after we've sort of looked at toes, and we'll start back here because that's where I'm standing. What I want to do next, and I'm just going to reach down here and touch him, is I want to look down here, okay, at his pastern. Okay, so his pastern are sort of like the bones in your hand, okay, the tarsals in your hand. And typically, when we look at the angle of the pastern, and as we go through the angle of the toes, we want to see probably about a 60 or 65 degree angle. I'm not worried so much about the actual number, all right? I just don't want him to walk back on his pasterns. I just don't want him to be what they call coon-footed. Anybody ever watch the coon walk? All right, and so they walk back on their pasterns. They don't have any flex, or maybe they have too much flex. They don't have any tension in their pasterns, and that's really tough on animals that are in rocks or in really rough country, and they're always walking back on their pasterns. And you can see that both in the front feet up here and back in the hind feet, on all 4 feet, you know, he's up on his pasterns. And so lots of times when a bull starts to have feet and leg problems, they'll have feet problems first. They'll have them back here in the pastern. And it's more important to pay attention to that in young animals, okay? Because if you don't, by the time he gets to be this big, or as big as the bull is that's on the end over there, they'll have really tough problems with their pasterns. They'll break down on you. And it's sort of like, you know, if you have a rock in your shoe, everybody's had one of those, or a rock in your boot, and you're walking around on the surface and you sort of gimpy look, you don't want to do anything. You want to try to get it out. You don't want to check heat. You don't want to breed cows, okay? You don't want to have an 18 or 2,000 pound bull jump on top of you and breed you. And so that's the kind of thing that's important to pay attention in terms of feet and legs. So while we're back through, let's kind of look at the leg structure. And so what we have right here, if you think about what this is, okay, in terms of your, this is the same as the ankle, okay? So your ankle corresponds, okay, to his to his hock back here. So here's his hock, here's his pastern. These are the long bones in your feet, okay, that go to your toes. And so we want to sort of see pretty much of a straight line tie into here. And as we come up, we want to see a sort of a straight line as we move up. So right here, this is his pin bone, okay? So I have a pelvis over there. I'll get it out in a minute. This is his pin bone, okay, his tailbone. And up here, right up here, you can kind of push on a little bit. Right there, that's his hip bone or his hook bone, okay? But so we want to be able to sort of draw a straight line. As we come down, we're going to draw a straight line right through here, right through the middle of his hock, down through the middle of his pastern, and it's going to drop right on the back side of his hoof. Pretty nice. Not every animal's going to be that way. And yes, he's standing a little bit different. All right, we wouldn't be able to do that on the left-hand side because he's got that foot tucked up underneath him. But if he's standing pretty natural, we can do that. Okay, so now this is his hock, all right? And now there's a bone that comes up out of his hock, and this is essentially the bones that are in your leg, okay? So this is the tibia and fibula, and in him, they're fused, not in you. Okay, you can break both of those bones in your leg, but here they're fused, and they kind of come up at an angle, and they tie in at what's called the stifle joint. So some people call that a muscle, and that's where it is right here. Okay, so this is the stifle, and if you think about, okay, this is my ankle, and then the next joint up here is what? So if you go up from your ankle, what's the next joint in your leg? Your knee, right? And so this is the knee. Okay, so if you have a dog sometimes that's very active and they have an ACL tear, you know, and your veterinarian has to fix it. Well, that's exactly what happens here. Sometimes football players get that, right? And so, you know, they've got a cap. They have like a knee cap here that fits over the stifle. And that's where the bone ties in. So it ties in right here, okay? And then this is a humerus bone that comes up here and ties into the pelvis back at this angle. And we'll show you some of those angles here in a second. But as I said, this bull walks pretty darn good. And so I'm not too worried about what his angles are, because I'm just kind of showing you where everything's at as we draw along them. But this is important because lots of times when a bull goes up to mount a cow, to breed a cow that's in heat, another bull comes along and bangs him right here to push him off. And then that can damage that joint. And then that bull's crippled, okay? He may not actually ever be able to mount and breed another cow, and so then he sort of walks, he's sort of like if you have a bad knee, right? You kind of limp around, okay? And so he's going to walk around here in just a second. I'm going to walk over here and get my pelvis. So one thing about it, whenever you do this job, you need to have two things. You need to have something that you can kind of pass around or show in case the animal acts up, right? And so that's what I've got right here. This animal's not acting up. So this is a pelvis. Okay, it's actually a cow pelvis, but it'll kind of give you an idea, okay? And so these are the hooks, or the hip bones, okay? Sometimes we call those the wings, and you can kind of see how they're at. And then back here, this is the back end, here's the tail coming out. Here are the pin bones, okay? And so lots of times in Brahman cattle, okay, we'll see this hip bone, okay, this pelvis, is about like this, okay? And I want you to look at the angle that's between those two. So if you look at that angle, you see there's like about a 45 or so degree angle between the hip bones, okay, and the pin bones. Everybody kind of see that? And so lots of times when we try to breed cattle, we want to make them flat rump. You've probably heard that term in the show, sometimes in the junior shows, when they talk about the steer show. They talk about a really flat rump, and so here's what we're doing is we're kind of rotating that like this. And when you do that, you tend to make those cattle a little bit more straighter legged. And so they don't walk nearly as well, okay? And I tell you what, something else I think that happens is that I think it affects calving knees a little bit. Of course, we're not worried about that in steers, but we are in cows. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we see in Brahman influenced cattle and Brahman cattle is that, you know, we haven't changed that hip structure very much. They still walk really smooth and easy, and then we don't really affect calving knees, at least from the standpoint of changing physical structure. Okay, so now let's look at where we're going to go next. So we've sort of got the back, all right? We've got the back kind of figured out. And so let's go back up here to the front because we sort of ignored that. And by the way, if we look at this animal, okay, if we were going to cut him in half like they do in a beef plant somewhere, so he's got about 13 ribs, okay? He's got exactly 13 ribs. And so we're right here. And so we'd sort of split him about right here, okay? And so this is the hind quarter, and that's the forequarter. And even if he didn't have this hump, about 52% of the animal is in the front, and only 48% is in the back. Okay? Probably even more is in the front with that hump, right? And so this is the power. This is the engine. Okay? This is what drives this animal. And so if you look back, you see a lot of muscle, right? This is a round. So if you like round steaks, If you like chicken fried steaks, this is where they come from. But up here in the front, this is a steering mechanism, okay? So that's a steering wheel, so that helps him sort of figure out which way he's going to go, okay? And so when he comes back around, we're going to talk about the front. But as he walks, as you look from behind, we didn't draw any lines back there, but if you take that pin bone and you drew a straight line that went through the middle of the hop, all the way down to the middle of the pastern, out to the back behind both toes, okay, he's got a really good straight angle behind him, okay? All right, so now let's look at his front. So we start down here. Hang on, Bubba. I know it's... we come down here, we have a little bit steeper angle. And by the way, if you look at animals when they walk, if you look at yourself when you walk, you know, I know that in a show ring, you know, they want those front feet to be just like my front feet. Maybe they want them a little bit wider because they say, you know, the wider they are, the more muscling they have between them, right? Between their front legs and their hind legs. And so we're going to have, I don't have nearly as much muscle as I used to have, okay? So I have to spread mine out a little bit even though I don't have a show stick. But nonetheless, okay, so they want them to, those toes to sort of point straight out. And in the hind end, that's pretty easy to do. But in the front end, even a bull that's as practiced as this guy, his toes are going to turn out just a little bit. And that's natural. Okay, because remember what the front end does? It's a steering mechanism, right? So it's got to be ready to go to the right or to the left. And if you look down at your feet right now, you'll see that a lot of you have got your toes turned out just a little bit. Because you haven't decided that when you get up, whether you're going to go to the left or to the right. But when you walk, the same way. Your feet will be turned out a little bit. And that's okay. That's sort of natural. So let's come back and let's look at it. So we're going to draw a line up. We've got about a 60-degree angle. Once again, okay, we're at the pastern. And now we're going to come up. And what is this right here? What do we call this on us? We call that a knee on him. But what is it on us?
Wrist.
It's our wrist. You get it. Who said that? You get an A. Gold star for today, okay? Go get yourself another mimosa, okay? That's exactly right, okay? That's the same as our wrist, but that we call that his knee. All right, and those are fused, so those are the long bones in your hand, and they're fused into the wrist. And then, of course, we have the radius and ulna, tibia and fibia now, that come up here and they tie into the elbow. So we call it his elbow. What is it on us? Yeah, it's our elbow. Exactly, except it's a little bit more pronounced. So his fibia, or his funny bone, excuse me, has got a much larger end to it. And so that's what you see right here. Okay, and so that ties into his elbow, and it's tucked in really close. Because his arm bones, okay, his humerus, I said the humerus in the back, that was actually the femur. His humerus, okay, comes in at an angle. Now there's a bunch of nerves that come together right here, underneath this skin. And so lots of times when you give shots, when you give injections, sometimes for subcutaneous injections, you might use this elbow pocket on the other side if it's a show animal, right? Because you want to hide it. But you need to be really, really careful that that needle does not penetrate, and you don't use high volume product in that elbow pocket, because you can very easily nick those nerves, okay, and cause some paralysis, and we don't want to do that. So I just pointed it out while we're there. Now from the elbow, the bone, the humerus, goes on up into the shoulder, okay? And one of the things that a lot of people always talk about is open-shouldered bulls. We don't have very many of those anymore. Certainly not in this breed, okay? But what I like to see is we're looking at these bulls. Bubba's going to walk around one more time. It's all right. He may even lay down, and that's okay. That's all right, Bubba. Take 5, okay? And so when we look at it, we want that shoulder to tie in. Now, on a bull that doesn't have a hump, okay, on a breed that doesn't have a hump, sometimes you can see the tops of those shoulder blades, and then you sort of see like there's a little indentation in between there. We would like to really see them tied in better than that, okay? We would like to see them tied in better than that. The other thing that I'm going to be interested in as I look at the bulls, and of course, I want you to realize that almost all the breeds, including the Brahman breed, has got a really good set of expected progeny differences for cavities and for birth weight. And so, if I'm interested in, if I'm worried about cavities and birth weight, I'm going to look at the genetic information. Okay, but for breeds that don't have that kind of good information, a lot of times folks are going to look at see how wide-shouldered these bulls are. If they're what they call open-shouldered, where the shoulder blades tie in at the front. There's a lot of angle. Is he really wide? Is he smooth in front? Okay, and so there's a lot of folks that worry about that. As long as he's not real angular in front, as long as he's really smooth fronted, I don't have any problem with that. I want to see him wide. I want to see him wide in the back, and I want to see him wide in the front, because that's where the muscle is. Okay? That's where the muscle is. And then, of course, I want to see some breed character. I want to see a head on him. So this is going to sound a little funny, but we don't pay enough attention sometimes, not necessarily in your breed, but in some other breeds, and looking at the mouth. Okay? We have some problems in some breeds in terms of parrot mouth, okay? Either overshot or undershot jaws. So either the front, the top mandible is longer, that's parrot mouth. And so it actually comes out over the lower mandible. They call that a parrot mouth. Everybody knows what a parrot looks like. Or the opposite sometimes can happen, and we can have a monkey mouth. Okay, and a monkey mouth is where the bottom mandible is actually longer than the top mandible. All right, and so you don't see that sometimes because they have nice big lips, right? Yes, sir. Pretty hair. We actually think that may be a major gene that causes that. We're not sure, but we're pretty sure that it's a major recessive gene that may cause one or the other. But for sure, it's just a couple of genes that affect that. And so it's pretty easy to select for, like all recessive genes, okay? Like all recessive genes, it's pretty easy to see, except that if it's matched by a dominant gene, you don't see the heterozygotes. But if you have a homozygous recessive individual that's affected, you see it. What that means then is that both the sire and the dam probably are carrying the gene for the genetic condition, so they're both carriers. Does that mean you have to get rid of them? What happens if they have really good pedigrees or they have really good genetics? You just want to be really careful not to breed those cattle to other carriers. Because if you do, about 1 out of 4, okay, are going to be affected. And so we used to say, oh, if it's a carrier of a genetic recessive, let's cut its head off, okay? Back in the 1950s, when we had snorter dwarfs in the Hereford breed, that's what we did. We identified carriers, and we removed them from the breed. That was before my time, by the way. I'm not quite that old. But now we've realized that carrier animals, okay, may have good genetics in other traits. So let's just say you had an animal that maybe had one of these conditions, but maybe he was a high marbling bull. Or maybe she was a very fertile female. So she has other attributes that makes her more valuable to the breed. And so what we just want to do is make sure that we never mate her or him to another carrier. You never get rid of genetic recessives, okay? They're in terms of the breed, they're always in the breed at a very low frequency. Okay, and so it's really hard to get rid of them without a lot of expensive testing, even with genetic testing that we have today. Okay, so even one of the largest breeds that has the largest numbers of cattle that are registered every year, okay, they even realize that even though they have a lot of genetic recessives, they can test for them, identify them, and then they encourage their breeders, hey, basically don't do carrier by carrier matings. Those cattle have other attributes. They have other genetics that make them important. So I just wanted to bring that up in terms of looking at the mouth. It's not that your breed has that problem, Some other breeds do, but do pay attention. We spend a lot more time talking about feet and legs than we do about mouths, and I think we probably need to spend a little time at least looking at that. Now, he's a bull, right? And so one of the things that we want to look at also is we want to make sure he has good scrotal circumference, and we want to look at his reproductive organ. We want to look at his sheath and his penis. Okay, whenever he's ready. Okay, he's taking a little break there. And so typically on a young bull that's about 14 months of age, we want to see something that has at least a 32 centimeter scrotal circumference. So on a bull, how old is he? He's 5'4". He's a 7. Okay, so he's 4. Let's just call him 4. Okay, so he's 4 years old. So if we measured his scrotal circumference today, it might be 48 centimeters. And so for those of y'all that failed metrics in high school, okay, it takes 2.5 centimeters to make an inch. Okay? And so essentially when we're talking about 34 centimeters, we're talking about 11 or 12 inches in terms of circumference. Okay? Not very big. Doesn't have to be very big. But maybe he's 48. So what does that tell me about him as a bull? If I get him fertility tested, the veterinarian comes out and they collect semen and they look at him and he's got 90% motility and very, very, very few abnormalities, and they measure his scrotal circumference. They'll reach inside his rectum and they'll palpate his accessory organs. Okay, and then so what does that 48 or 42 or whatever scrotal circumference tell me? Basically, at his age, it's basically how much he can store, right? But on that young bull, that bull that's 14 months of age or 16 months of age, those bulls that have larger scrotal circumferences, what that means is that they reach puberty at an earlier age. And what that also means is that their sons and daughters will reach puberty at an early age. And in the breed that we worry about, reaching puberty at a little bit earlier age, okay, than some of the others, that's something that's important. Typically, Brahman cattle have a little bit smaller scrotal circumference at a given age than other breeds do, but that's okay because as long as they're fertile, as long as they're producing, okay, 70% or better, and they pass their BSC, that's fine. But we can still work on scrotal circumference. Scrotal circumference tapes are cheap. You can use them. You have an EPD for it. That's one of the things that y'all need to report on your bulls. Now, as far as the sheath, so I remember when we used to have some really horrendous sheaths 50 or 60 years ago. But the Brahman cattle that used to run around here, that when a breed was formed, they had pretty good sheaths. I wasn't alive then, okay, but I've seen pictures. All right? And those cattle had pretty good sheaths. We just sort of got away from it for a while, and now we paid a lot more attention to it. And you can see Bubba's got a really good sheath. I used to have a professor at A&M, his name was Mr. Frank Litters, and he always talked about evaluating a bull sheath, a particular Brahman bull or a bull that had some Brahman genetics by looking at 3 things, okay? He wanted to look at whether or not the bull, the opening to his prepuce, was it really big, was he really lazy, did his penis fall out? That's how he used to describe it. And if they didn't, that's good. That's a plus in their favor. Then the next thing he said is to sort of look at what the angle is, okay? So the angle of his sheath. And if you look at the angle of his sheath, it comes out at or above his pasterns. Okay, everybody see that angle? And then the third thing he said, draw an imaginary line from the bull's pasterns all the way up to his knee, okay? And we call that the A to B line, for lack of a better term. And is it above that line? It's about at that line. 2 of those 3 things, if he meets 2 of those 3 things, then he has an acceptable sheath. Now, leather on an animal is highly correlated to growth. The amount of extra skin that they have, okay, is genetically correlated to growth. Not real well, but there's a correlation there. And so you look for cattle that have a little bit more sheath, maybe they have a little bit more dewlap up here, okay? Then they maybe grow a little bit, put a little bit more, you know, you got to have a little bit more skin to put a little bit more muscle in. But still you can pay attention to those kinds of things. And it may not be a big problem if you've got coastal Bermuda grass pastures, but down in my part of the country where you have a lot of blackbrush and a lot of cactus, it can be an issue, okay? It can be an issue. Now, if he were a she, if this were a heifer, at around 14 months of age, there's a couple of other things that I would try to do. Maybe right before breeding, I would go in with a glove through the rectum and I would palpate her reproductive tract. And I would try to assess a reproductive tract score. Your veterinarian can probably do this. And so essentially, you know, they have, like everything else, they have like a score that goes from 1 to 5. 1 is an infertile tract, and 5 is a cycling, very fertile tract. Or fertile, actually, sorry. And I try to look for a 3 or better. And so when I reach in there, okay, and actually I'm going to use this hand, I want to find a tract, okay, that if I'm picking it up, I want it to be about the size of my index finger or better. That's what a 3 looks like, okay? If it's smaller than that, it's a 2 or 1. It's either subfertile or infertile. If it's bigger than that, I don't care, okay? That's all right. And certainly if you palpate cows for pregnancy, you ought to be able to pick up a reproductive tract in the young heifer. Now, they're going to be a little bit smaller in a Brahman heifer than they're going to be in, say, an Angus or a Charolais heifer. I understand that. But once you sort of get the hang of it, you'll be able to sort those out. 20%, 1/5 of the heifers that are palpated for reproductive tract score are subfertile tracts. And so if you're trying to do an AI program, or if you're trying to put your heifers out with some bulls, okay, and you turn a set of heifers out you have no idea about it except that they're 14 or 16 months of age, it could be that 1 out of 5 of them don't breed on time or come into heat because they have a subfertile or infertile tract. And so that's one thing, when we have a bull out here, we talk about evaluation. That's one thing I think that's important. We need to talk about the heifer side as well. Okay? Any questions so far? Everybody frozen? Okay, so let's just pretend for a second. So yeah, I got some questions while we're standing around inside where it was warm about carcass information, okay? So y'all have a really good carcass program. You have a really good bull gain test program. And a number of breeders do their own bull gain test program, like right here, okay? And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. And we talked about this particular animal. So he weighs a lot more than the average feed yard steer. So the average feed yard steer today weighs about 1,350, almost 1,400. So on that steer, he would have about an 850-pound carcass. Pretty big sized guy, okay? And as I said before, you know, he's got 13 ribs. If we cut him in half, if we split him down the middle, and then we break him right here between the 12th and the 13th rib, okay, we'd have a bunch of carcass back here, we'd have a bunch of carcass back here, up there. Now, he's a Brahman, he's a steer. If he were a steer, he wouldn't have this big hump. But he'd still have a pretty massive hump. Most of the time when we measure humps on straight bred Brahman steers, we're measuring a hump that's probably about 9.5 to 10 inches. So his is more than that. Okay? And so we have a lot of hump on him. What do you reckon, what happens to that on those carcass steers? What happens to that hump?
Ground meat.
Yeah, in the past it would go into ground meat. And so if he were a carcass steer, half of what you would see in his carcass would become ground trimmings worth about 90 cents a pound. 50% lean ground trimmings would be worth about 90 cents a pound. All right, but you know what, that hump, they figured out, you know, we can grind that hump and we get 90 cents for it. But you know, we have some folks that want to buy hump. We have some restaurants. We have some individuals that want to buy hump. And now, you know what that hump is worth? He's going to lay down again. I don't blame him because I'm talking about killing him. All right? Yeah, cover his ears. There you go. There you go, good. That hump is worth $4 a pound. Huh? $4 a pound. And so I'm going to hazard a guess that that's probably a $100 hump on that guy. Yeah, so, you know, they've been talking about maybe y'all need to breed the humps off. Maybe they need to be bigger. Huh? Maybe they need to be bigger. Okay, but anyway, so my point is that, you know, everything's got a purpose. The other day I was at the meat store down in Corpus, some friends of mine, and so down here below the elbow on the lower leg, down between the elbow and the knee, so everybody knows what I'm talking about, this big part right here, right? Thank you. That's called the shank. And so the front shanks, the left and the right, and the hind shanks, the left and the right, represent about 6% of the carcass. Those shanks, okay, they're about 8 or 9 pounds in a steer, okay? And they're selling those shanks for about $3 a pound, intact. And so they're, in a typical feed yard steer, they're probably about 10 inches in height, and at the top, they're probably about, you know, 3 or 4 inches, 3 inches in diameter, and then at the bottom, okay, at the bottom at this point, they're probably about 4 or 5 inches in diameter. They're mostly bone. They're mostly bone, but apparently some barbecue aficionados have figured out that you can smoke those things and then grab a corn tortilla and pull that meat off, sort of like barbacoa of the leg. And so instead of cutting that up for soup bones at your local Mexican food restaurant that goes into caldo, okay, at $2 a pound, they're bringing $4 a pound for that product. And it's about 40 to 50% bone. Okay, I'm not sure what they're doing with the bone afterwards. So, you know, they're doing some different things. You know, packers are creative. So if you look at this guy, let's just pretend, okay, so we already talked about him as being a carcass steer. We had to cover his ears, not hurt his feelings. So if he were a carcass steer, weighed 850 pounds, if he were choice, so the packing plant would have bought him from you for about $1.24 a pound live. So 1,350 pounds times $1.24. Y'all can do the math. All right, and then when they turn him into a carcass, if he grades choice, he's worth $2.88 a pound. So 850 pounds of carcass, okay, that you bought that was sold live for $1.24 is now worth $2.88. There's less of him, but there's more per pound. If he were a select, okay, he would be worth about $2.66 per pound. His carcass would be. And that difference between those two values is what's called the choice select spread. Right now, it's about $20 per hundredweight in carcass between a choice and a select. Okay? Not too long ago, a couple of months ago, that was double that, almost $40. But what you don't remember or may not know is that during the summertime, select cattle were actually bringing a premium to choice. Not for very long, but we were running out of lean cattle, and most of the time we look at cull cows and bulls to supply our lean product, or imports from Australia and other countries to supply that lean product. We were running short, so select cattle were actually bringing a slight premium to choice during that time. Meat market does funny things. Okay? So if we look at this guy, we said 52%, 40%, everything that's driven, everything on this animal, if he were a market steer or a market heifer, everything is going to be driven by 25% of the carcass. From about right here to about right here. Okay, so this is the rib, right, to here, and then here's the loin. All right, so that'll kind of give you an idea. Here's the rib, so this is going to represent on a feeder steer or a fed heifer, about 9%. This part right here is the loin, and then this is a sirloin. So these two things together are about 16%. So if you add 16 and 9, you get 25, right? A fourth of the carcass drives the price of the entire carcass. So right now, ribeyes are worth about $5 a pound. So if I was a packer and I was selling ribeyes, I would sell them to HEB or to somebody else, there he goes again, for $5 a pound. During the summertime, they would have been less than that. Why are ribeyes high right now? What's going on? What are we coming into? Holiday season. Is it cold right now? Yeah. And so we're going to give standing prime rib roast for Thanksgiving and for Christmas and maybe for New Year's. And so that's the reason why there's a big demand for that product. All right, now the loins are back here, so you may not know what a loin is, but a loin is like a Kansas City strip or New York strip. All right, so now they're cheaper. They're about $4 a pound, maybe a little bit more. During the summertime, during the peak of grilling season, these guys are worth more, and the ribeyes are worth less. So the next time you go to the grocery store, pay attention to what's out there in that coffin case. If you go to the grocery store and buy your meat and say, you know, I want a steak, well, right now, don't buy ribeyes. Okay, if price is interesting, go look at the loins. And then next year, during the summertime, then you can buy ribeyes, okay? If you're thinking about how you price things. Now, a little bit further back, this is where the sirloins are, okay? And that's where the T-bones and the porterhouses come from. So actually you have a couple of T-bones, and you have a couple of porterhouses, and then you get into the sirloins. I'm sort of a sirloin kind of guy because I want to have some mouthfeel to my product. When I eat a steak, I want to be able to chew it a little bit. All right? I'm not a big fan, lots and lots of marble. Okay? I'm not necessarily one of those kinds of guys that likes to have a really fatty steak because I like some mouthfeel. But this is where the sirloins come from, back here. Now, the interesting thing is that chuck steaks, that I'm sure that Judd and Gayla and a lot of you older folks, not that they're old, but they're at least older than some of you, we remember 7-bone steaks and 7-bone roasts because if you take that shoulder blade and you cut it right across it and you look down at it, it looks like a 7-bone. And that's what we call it. We don't use that anymore. Inside that shoulder blade, so here's his shoulder blade right here. Underneath that shoulder blade is supposedly one of the most tender muscles in the entire carcass, with the exception of the tenderloin. And the tenderloin, by the way, runs underneath the spinous, underneath the vertebrae right along here. It's not very big. It's about 7 pounds on each side, but it's worth about $12 to $13 a pound because it's very, very tender. But up here underneath the shoulder blade is what's called the flat iron steak. It's not very big. There's about 3 or 4 pounds of it underneath the shoulder blade. But that's one of the things that, like your checkoff dollars, when they looked at breaking these animals apart and looking at muscles and what are new muscles that they can utilize. So there's a lot of different things. But so we talked about the choice select spread. We talked about how this 1/4 of the carcass right here drives the price over the rest of it. You'd be surprised to know that there's almost no difference in the price that we pay for choice chuck or select chuck. A little bit difference in terms of price for what we do for back here in the round. We get a little bit more for choice round than we do for select round. And then, of course, what he's laying on between his legs is his brisket, right? Okay? And so briskets, the other day I saw a brisket at the store at $4 a pound. Okay? Weighed 25 pounds. It's a $100 brisket. Wow, that's crazy, isn't it? What that brisket is worth as a packer, and me sending it to HEB or somebody, doesn't make any difference whether it's choice or select, or even worse, no roll. Okay? it's worth $2.50 a pound. Okay, so there's a lot of demand for it. Normally those briskets are in the neighborhood of about half that. Okay? All right, and of course the head, right? Everybody like barbacoa? So barbacoa is a Mexican term for cooking the head, and really to do a really good job, needs to be cooked in the ground, right? A hole in the ground overnight. All right, I'll never forget the first time my sister-in-law and my wife decided to cook one in the oven, and my sister-in-law unwrapped it and says, it's still staring at me. But it was good. So barbacoa, so those heads are worth about 50 bucks a piece. Think about that. The tongue that's in that animal's head is worth about $5 a pound. And if it's a pink tongue, it's worth a little bit more than a colored tongue. Okay, so a lot of those tongues are going to go to markets in Asia, primarily Japan and South Korea and maybe Taiwan. And while we're talking about markets, you know, we always think about our traditional markets of being, you know, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, and Mexico and Canada. You know who our third largest trading partner is now? It's pretty close to Japan, pretty close to Taiwan, pretty close to South Korea. Any guesses? China. Okay, they're not necessarily taking our highest quality product, but they're taking a lot of other products. They basically have pushed Canada and Mexico down just a little bit in terms of what they're getting. All right, any questions?
Yes.
Yes, Marcos.
About the neck.
Yes, sir?
I read a lot the Bozeman book, and I see the show range going to the long, extended neck.
Uh-huh.
And all that we learned before was that thick, muscle, more masculine neck. Do you see any difference in fertility or any other?
Well, you know, we didn't talk about that. So the reason why this bull's sort of dark colored, you see it around his head and back here on his hump. So testosterone does that, right? It causes, the male hormone causes the darkening, and it also causes muscle expression. Okay? And females exhibit that, you know, they secrete estrogen, and so typically we don't see that muscle expression. We don't see that darkening of the skin, okay, or that darkening of the hair. And so we see this big bulgy muscle. You know, as far as the neck, I don't want them to have what we used to call a U-neck, E-W-E neck. Everybody knows what a ewe-lamb looks like. They have a real long, narrow neck. Okay, on my bulls, I want to see a little bit more crest. I want to see a little masculinity. I don't want a really long neck. I think that's a little too feminine. And remember, I'm looking at this animal trying to think about, okay, what sort of hormones? Is he expressing male hormones? Does it look more like a female? And so I want to see some crest. I don't want to see a real long neck on my bulls. I don't want to see a real long head on my bulls. Okay? So while we're talking about these hormonal influences, you know, testosterone, basically what it does is it shuts down long bone growth. Okay, and so it makes a bull makes a male, okay, have a shorter, wider head. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about sheep or goats or horses or hogs or cattle. Okay? Maybe us, I'm not sure. Okay? Typically, females will have a little bit longer, narrower head. They'll also have less muscle here. It'll make their neck look more refined and longer. Okay? And so, you know, that's to me. As far as the neck, as long as it looks good on the animal, doesn't look out of balance, and it allows that animal to put its head down on the ground to eat grass, I'm good with it. Okay? But yeah, I see what you're saying. I know what you're saying. I don't want to see a real thin neck bull. I want to see a smooth neck female. I want to see some masculinity on the bull side. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
You was talking about the hump earlier.
Yes, sir.
How are they cutting it up now in the States? Or?
No, they're selling it intact. So, you know, they'll split him down the middle, right? And of course, you know, he's a bull, so he's got a much larger hump. But so we're talking about, you know, I'm just going to sort of draw my hand here. We're going to talk about a hump that looks sort of about that size. And so it'll be split down the middle, and typically those humps are about 5 to 6 pounds. AC, you're right. AC, when we bought those humps, they were what, 4 or 5 to a box, and there was 40-pound box, so they were 8 pounds. 8 pounds to a side. So on those steers, they were probably 16-pound humps, and it was split down the middle. So they were about 8 pounds, and they don't cut them up, they're intact. So it's just a massive muscle, and all this is just the shoulder muscle that runs across your backbone. I mean, across your shoulder blade, that's what this is.
Then just cook it like a roast?
Cook it like a roast. And I'm not an expert on telling you how to cook a hump, so there's probably some people in here that are. But as I understand it, they cook it like a roast. Now, I've eaten it. The South Texas Brahman Breeders Association had their meeting a couple of weekends ago, and they served hump there. So, and it was very good. It was very tender. They cooked it like in a pressure cooker. There is a lot of fat tissue in here, and there's a lot of connective tissue. But once you sort of break that down, it was very, very tender, very, very tasty.
Dr. Joe,
Yes, sir.
I understand that at some point during the show this week they're going to do a cook-off. I don't know what day, but I remember seeing.
Is that right, HC? They're going to do a cook-off?
Friday.
Friday.
Friday, okay.
I'm going to miss it. Sorry.